Hello everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the Research Facility on Inequalities. I'm Amanda David, I'm a research officer with IFD and the scientific coordinator of the facility. This program, funded by the EU and implemented by IFD, comprises more than 20 research projects on a wide array of topics, and we're actually launching this weekly webinar series in order to disseminate some of the results. We therefore invite you to join us every Monday at 5 p.m. Paris time in order to talk about topics such as labor market and earnings, urban water services, education, health, social protection, and taxation, all of them with an inequality lenses. Before we kick off, a few guidelines on the webinar. As you can see, we have a Q&A or questions feature where you will be able to type your questions. The panelists will respond to these questions after the presentation, but if there are any co-authors who are present, I invite them to maybe reply to any clarification questions that might arise during the presentation. All the questions are public, and after the presentation, I will select a couple of them that I will address to the panelists. Finally, the webinar is recorded and a replay will be available, but do stick around as we'll probably cut all the funny parts in the replay. Now, let me introduce you our panelist, Aurora Ramirez, who is an assistant professor of economics at Colegio de Mexico, and who will present the paper, Perceptions of Inequality and Social Mobility in Mexico. The paper is co-written with Raimundo Campos, Alice Crozer, Rodolfo de la Torre, and Roberto Vélez. Welcome, Aurora. And you have 30 minutes.
Thanks, David Anda, for inviting me. As Anda was saying, I'm going to present this paper of Perceptions of Inequality and Social Mobility, which was co-authored by researchers at El Colegio de México and El Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias. This paper received the financial assistance of the European Union and was coordinated by the AFD. Well, let's start. What's the motivation for this paper? Well, the persistence of inequality continues to puzzle researchers across disciplines. It is important to understand perceptions about inequality and prospects of social mobility in a given context, because this can help us explain why people tolerate differences between the rich and the poor, and also it can help us explain how perceptions about inequality relate to redistributional preferences. We are going to study these questions in the context of Mexico. Mexico is one of the countries with the highest inequality and lowest social mobility in the world. Just to give you an example, using current household income, the ratio of decile 10 to decile 1 is of around 18.3. So we are going to study these questions in a context of high inequality. In particular, we are going to tackle 3 questions. The first question that we are going to tackle is, how do Mexicans of different socioeconomic background, that is, of different wealth levels, perceive inequality and social mobility levels in the country? The second question that we are going to tackle in the paper is, how does providing information using an experimental setup affect desired levels of inequality and social mobility? We are going to provide information on both actual levels of inequality in the country and social mobility. And we are going to try to disentangle which one of this, which type of information influences more, or if it influences desired levels of inequality and social mobility. And finally, the third question that we are going to try to tackle is how do responses of individuals to this new information relate to wealth and to redistribution preferences? How do we tackle these questions? Well, we conducted a nationally representative survey at the urban level in which we gauge how social mobility and inequality are perceived in Mexico. We also ask questions about desired levels of inequality, desired levels of social mobility, desired levels of taxes, as well as the shape of the distribution of income Mexicans perceived. This survey was conducted between April and May of 2019. We surveyed around 2,493 households. 643 of those households are located in the metropolitan area of Mexico City. We also surveyed 6 other cities, around 280 and 330 households in each of the following metropolitan areas: Ciudad Juárez, Monterrey in the north, Acapulco and Villahermosa in the south, León and San Luis Potosí in the central region. So we cover all the regions in Mexico. We divided these 2,400 households into 3 equally sized groups. One of these groups was our control group, and the other 2 groups, they received informational treatments. One of these informational treatments was a treatment about what were the inequality levels in the country, and the second informational treatment was about what were the actual social mobility levels in the country. Okay, there's a clarification here. Is the survey representative at the national level or of urban areas only? National level, but only urban level. And what share of total population is represented by the sample? I'm not sure about this question, but we can later clarify. I can later clarify it with the individual that asked this question. Okay, so so as I was explaining you, there were 2 interventions. In the next slide, I'm going to explain particularly what was the information given to the individuals. Well, the information about inequality, the intervention about inequality particularly revealed the following information to individuals. Academic studies and media reports have shown that the level of inequality in Mexico is high. These are the numbers. Out of every 100 pesos the economy generates, approximately 60 pesos go to the richest people in the country, those that are in the top 10%. By contrast, the poorest people in the country, those in the bottom 10% of income, receive only 2 pesos. And here we show them a cartoon in which there is this big fat guy saying, "Inequality, I see you very equal." And what was the intervention about social mobility? The intervention on social mobility was the following. Academic studies and media reports have shown that the level of social mobility in Mexico is bad. These are the numbers. If you are born poor, it is very difficult to move up to the middle or upper class. For every 10 people born into poverty, 7 will remain poor and not even 1 will become rich. That is, if you are born poor, you will die poor, and if you are born rich, you will very likely die rich. The control group is given no information. So next, what I'm going to show you is how do Mexicans perceived the distribution of income in Mexico. One of the nice features of our survey is that we will be able to see how many people do Mexicans perceive that they are poor, how many people perceive that they are rich, and that is the shape of the distribution of income. In particular, in the next slide, I'm showing you the following. One of the questions that we asked was, what is the maximum income per person monthly what is the maximum income to be considered poor per person monthly? So here what I'm showing you is that Mexicans on average think that the maximum income a person needs to perceive, needs to earn to be considered poor is of around 2,548 pesos. In dollars, this is around $280 in PPP. And also Mexicans think that on average, there are around 59% of people under the poverty line. How this figure compares to the real number? Well, official statistics say that there are around 49% of Mexicans under the poverty line. So Mexicans overestimate a little the percentage of people under poverty, but we are going to see that this perception is relatively accurate when compared to the perception of how many affluent or rich people are in the country. And that's what I'm showing you in this with this column. We also ask the following question: what is the average minimum income an individual needs to perceive monthly to be considered rich? And here we see that Mexicans think that this income should be of around 38,248 pesos. This is around $4,250 in PPP. Also, Mexicans think that on average, there are 35% of people earning or perceiving this income. This figure is very far from reality. According to official statistics, less than 0.6% of Mexicans perceive this income. So, although Mexicans have a relatively accurate perception of the number of poor people that exist in the nation, they vastly overestimate the number of rich people. Well, the next graph that I'm going to show you is how these perceptions of poor and rich people vary by wealth level. Here in our survey, we didn't ask about income because due to the upsurging violence in Mexico, we were concerned that asking about income would produce very high non-response rates. So we construct a wealth rank index using educational background, using characteristics of dwellings such as availability of sewers in the neighborhood, availability of other services. So here, what I'm showing you is in the graph is on the x-axis I have the wealth rank, and on the y-axis I have the maximum income to be considered poor. And here, as you can see, we have the regression line has a positive and significant slope. That is, the richer you are, you think that the maximum income to be considered poor is higher. The same can be say about the minimum income to be considered rich. We have a positive slope, but this slope is not statistically significant because, as we see here, we can see that the richer you are, you think that the minimum income to be considered rich is higher. However, because of the high dispersion of in these numbers, this slope is not statistically significant. But as you can well, next I'm gonna show you how the estimated share of poor and rich people that Mexicans perceived also by wealth rank. And here, as you can see, on average, Mexicans, as I was telling you, perceive that there are around 59% of poor people in the country. But as we can see, poor people perceive that they are more poor than rich people. Poor people perceive that there are more than 60% of poor people in the country, while rich people perceive that there are a little bit less than 60% of poor people. While for rich people, on average, we saw that this figure was of 35%. Poor people think that they are almost 40% of people which are rich, that is, that perceived an income of around of a little bit more than $4,000 in PPP, while rich people perceive that this figure is closer to 30. So as these graphs are showing us, Mexicans, perceptions of poverty and wealth for Mexican people vary by wealth rank. And here what we are seeing is that poor people perceive that there are two big groups in the country, a high number of poor people and a high number of rich people, while rich people perceive that there is a more graduated distribution of income with a lot of poor people and rich people, but also a middle-sized middle class. Next, what I'm going to show you is the results of asking questions about perceived inequality. How do we ask about perceived inequality? We ask about this question in the following way. We show Mexicans, we show individuals 6 hypothetical distributions of income. In the more equal distribution, there are 5 bars with equal heights, such that the 20% poorer individuals earn the same amount of income that the 20% richer individuals. And then in the most unequal distribution of income, all the heights of these bars are very unequal, such that we have that if the economy generates 100 pesos, 92% of them goes to the top 20%, to the richest 20%, while the less than 0.5 pesos go to the poorer 20%. So we ask Mexicans, what of these 6 hypothetical distributions do you think resembles more the distribution of income that exists in Mexico? And they have to choose between these 6 distribution of incomes. Then after they choose a distribution of income, we will convert this distribution of income into a Gini coefficient and record that as a Gini coefficient. So what we see here is that the blue lines, the blue columns represent the perceived distribution, the perceived Gini. So here we see that almost 3/4 of Mexicans think that there is a distribution of income with a Gini of at least 0.53. And and only 2.9% of Mexicans think that there is a very equal distribution of income. How this figure compares with actual numbers? Well, according to official statistics, the Gini coefficient in Mexico is of around 0.5, but there are some studies that when they consider the fact that rich people underreport their income, they say that the Gini could be as high as 0.7. So using, if we contrast this perceived inequality with reality, we see that Mexicans perceive inequality approximately correctly, approximately correctly. What about desired Gini? Well, we use the same methodology to reveal about what was the desired distribution of Mexicans, but instead of showing them 6 hypothetical distributions, we show them 6 hypothetical distributions, but we ask them, what do you think the distribution of income should be in Mexico? And here what we see is that around 25% of Mexicans think that we should have a Gini of 0, that is a perfectly equal distribution of income. And if we take the average over these desired Gini coefficients, our desired Gini in Mexico is of around 0.31. This desired Gini is the Gini that exists, for example, in France and in Canada, but is less equal than the Gini or the distribution of income that exists in Sweden. So we as Mexicans, we perceived high inequality, and we desire a more equal distribution of income, close to the levels that exist in France. We also asked in our survey about social mobility. Perceived and desired social mobility. Here, what I'm showing you is the following. Here, in this blue graph, here this graph says that out of 10 people, 10 children born poor, Mexicans perceive that 52 of them will remain poor as adults. And they perceive that out of 10 children born in the top quintile, 56 of them will remain rich as adults. These are persistent rates, that is, they are persistent rates at the bottom and at the top. How accurate are these perceptions? Well, according to some studies, persistent rates at the bottom and at the top of the distribution of income are of around 50%. That is, Mexicans' perceptions about persistence rates are very accurate. What about upward and downward social mobility? Here, Mexicans in the column in blue. Here, this column says that out of 10 people born poor, Mexicans perceive that 36 of them will be rich when adults. And about downward mobility, we see that out of 10 children born rich, Mexicans perceive that 31 will go to the bottom quintile when adults. These upward and downward mobility rates are very far from reality. According to studies, both upward and downward mobility rates are of around 2%. So despite the fact that Mexicans perceived persistent rates relatively accurate, we think that there's much more mobility than it really exists in our country. What about desired social mobility? Well, Mexicans will want that out of 10 people born poor, 70% of them become rich as adults, and that out of 10 people born in the middle of the income distribution, 66 of them go to the top quintile as adults. So as you can see, these numbers does not add to 100. We think people have trouble understanding concepts of relative social mobility. We think that they are thinking more about absolute social mobility. But this shows us that we desired more social mobility than what it exists now in our country. Now I'm going to show you the results of our intervention. The first panel shows the results of the inequality intervention, and the second panel shows the results of the social mobility intervention. Here, each row represents a separate regression line. For example, here we have as a dependent variable in the first row, the dependent variable is the Gini coefficient. Each coefficient must be interpreted relative to the control. We used as controls city fixed effects, age and age control, gender dominance, etc. However, since we have an experimental setup, these controls are not strictly necessarily, and we show in the paper that these controls, whether we use these controls or not, our results are robust. So here what we are seeing is that neither the inequality intervention nor the social mobility intervention have any effect on the desired Gini coefficient or the social mobility variables, neither on the desired taxes. Another message, another important message from these graphs is that the point estimates are very small, between -0.1 and 0.1 standard deviation. Here, how we interpret these results is that new information does not change our desired levels of social mobility and of inequality, because there was in 2018 a presidential campaign in which actual levels of inequality and actual levels of poverty were highly publicized. So as we saw in previous slides, Mexicans have a relatively accurate perception of inequality levels in the country. So since not new information was revealed, that's why these coefficients are small. That's our interpretation of our results. The next slide shows the following. Instead of using as a dependent variable desired levels of social mobility, here what we look is at the difference between perceived and desired levels. For example, the difference between perceived and desired levels of Gini and perceived and desired levels of mobility from quintile 1 from quintile 1. Here, what are the main messages from these graphs? Here, what we see is that since the coefficient on the perceived minus desired Gini is negative and statistically significant, what we see is that revealing information on inequality to Mexicans generates that a decrease in desired levels of inequality. Here, our interpretation of the results is that since Mexicans slightly overestimate inequality when revealing that the reality is less acute that they thought, or less bad that they thought, Mexicans adjust desire of levels of inequality upward. The other important message to see from this graph is the coefficient on standardized wealth. Here, what we see is that we have positive coefficients from social mobility from bottom to the top quintile and from the middle to the top quintile. Sorry. Here, what this says is that since, remember, this is the difference between perceived and desired levels. Since the difference between perceived and desired level is negative because we perceived less social mobility than we desired, then and as the coefficient on standardized wealth is positive, what we see is that the richer you are, the closer your desired and perceived level of social mobility is. That is, the poorer you are, the farther your perceived and desired levels. And that's the interpretation of our result. Finally, we also ask information about desired taxes. And here, a nice feature of our survey is that we ask about perceived taxes and desired taxes. In particular, the question was, what of out of 10 pesos, what fraction of your income you think you pay in consumption, property taxes, income taxes, etc. And what we see here is that the blue lines tell us that Mexicans on average perceive that they pay around 39% of their income in taxes. But they will desire to pay around 22% of their income in taxes. That is, they perceive that they pay more than they will like to pay. What is the reality? Well, the reality is that we pay around 22% of our income in taxes. That is what we pay in taxes. It is what we desire to pay, but we perceive that we are paying around 39% of the income, which is very far from reality. The graph at the right show also results for another set of questions. We also ask what fraction of their income do you think that the poor, the rich, and the median income should pay? The gray line says what fraction of the income should pay the rich. Again, sorry, I didn't clarify this, but here we are plotting this against wealth rank. So here what we have is that the poorest people want the rich to pay around 45% of their income, while the richest people want the rich to pay less than, well, around 35% of their income. The red line shows us what we would like, what Mexicans would like median income to pay, and we see that this is around 22%. And the blue line shows how much would you like the poor people to pay of their income, and here we see that this is around 14.5%. So there are three main messages that I want to emphasize from this graph. The first one is that Mexicans want a progressive tax system in which the rich pay more than poor people and the median income people. The second message is that tax progressivity preferences vary by wealth rank. That is, poor people want the rich to pay more than what rich people want. And the third message is that as you can see, this red line is very close to this other red line. So this other red line, remember, was desired taxes, well, how much I will desire to pay in taxes. As you see, how much I will desire to pay in taxes is close to how much I will desire the median income to pay in taxes. So Mexicans perceive themselves as being in the median, or each people perceive themselves as being in the median income. We also ask questions about willingness to give to achieve income inequality. That is, we ask people, if you had 10,000 pesos, how much of them were you willing to give to achieve a country with perfect equality? And as we can see here, well, we don't see this here, but on average, Mexicans are willing to give 11.4% of their income to achieve perfect equality, where poor people are willing to give more, around 15%, while rich people wants to give less than 10%. So willingness to give varies also by wealth rank. If we transform this coefficient into an Atkinson index, we will see that Mexicans' aversion to inequality is very low, and this Atkinson index compares or is very low when compared to what people is willing to give in Canada and in other countries such as Israel. And finally, this was a nice exercise that we wanted to see, is that one thing that we wanted to see is that since we have what are the taxes Mexicans propose for poor, for rich, and for median income people, we would like to see if or whether these taxes are consistent with the desired levels of inequality that we want as a country. So we did two, in the paper, we do two scenarios. Remember that participants propose tax rate for those they consider rich, middle, and poor groups. For rich, they propose a tax rate of around, on average, 40.8%, for middle income of around 22.7%, and for poor people, 14.5%. So what if we apply these taxes to the distribution of income Mexicans perceived, and then see what will be the level of inequality that these proposed taxes produced? In scenario 1, we use the rich and poor interpretation according to the size attributed to each group. That is, remember that we as Mexicans think that 35% of people is rich. So what if we tax these 35% of people, of rich people, with a tax rate of 40.8%, and we tax these 59% that we think that are poor with this 40.5%. So if we tax like that, here what we see is that the Gini coefficient goes from a gross income Gini of 0.55 to a net income Gini of 0.467. That is, inequality goes down. However, you remember that our desired inequality was of 0.31. So this coefficient is very far from what we desire. That is, the taxes we propose for rich and poor people are not consistent with the inequality levels that we desired. Using an alternative scenario in which we tax rich and poor people according to the real number of rich people and poor people that exist, that is less than, remember that I told you that less than 0.6% of people are rich, we will see that the Gini goes down even less to a Gini of 0.49. So basically, again, the message that this mathematical calculation is giving us is that the taxes that we propose for rich and poor people are not consistent with the desired levels of inequality that we want as Mexicans. Just to close, what are the policy recommendations for our based on our results? Is that one way to gain support for redistributive policies could be through improving the perception of inequality for the 40% of respondents who underestimated its actual level. Remember, there's a paper of Perez Truglia which shows that informing people about their true economic position, not the levels of inequality in the country, but their true economic position might change their redistributional preferences. So this might be one way to gain support for redistributive policies. Another thing that we see is that Mexicans have largely failed to connect inequality and public policy. So we think that this link must be emphasized in the public debate. We need better education about the connection between tax regimes and the income distributions they can produce. To conclude, our respondents have relatively accurate perceptions of inequality and persistent rates at the bottom and at the top of the distribution. However, there is much variation in perceptions of the income distribution by wealth rank of individuals. Poor people imagine a polarized distribution with a large cluster of poor people at the bottom and another cluster of the rich people at the top. Rich people perceive a more graduated distribution, including a large middle income group. So we also see that even though people want a progressive tax system in which the poor have a positive tax rate with higher tax rates for higher income individuals, the distribution they seek is not consistent with the taxes they propose for different income strata. So we think that future studies should further investigate whether information about the size of the tax base and the distributive impact of alternative tax regimes encourages people to support more aggressive redistributive policies. That would be all, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aurora. And thank you for the participants also for their questions. There were some interesting questions. I think some of them also more of clarification questions, especially on the definition of the rich and poor and the way you create the variable that measures the level of wealth and how you distribute them among quantiles. And then there was also a question on the gender disaggregation, and also a very interesting question on whether we talk about desired or acceptable level of inequality. And I think this one can also be related a little bit to how the individuals perceive the questions and whether the response expected from them has to do with their own, I would say, desired levels of inequality, or with more what they think the society should have as a level of inequality. And I think there's another question that I will save for later.
So about the if the survey was representative, yes, but at the urban level, that was clear, right?
Yeah.
The other was about desired or acceptable level of inequality, right? Here we are asking about desire. Well, the question is, what do you think the distribution of income should be for Mexico? It's a mixture, right, of desired and acceptable, but that's why I tried to give you the exact wording of the question. About gender disaggregation, that's something that we want to do, but still we have not explored anything and how do perceptions change depending on the gender, but we could potentially do it. The other question was about, let me see, what are the indicators of poor and the rich based on the resources available for families or households? I'm not sure if I understand correctly.
I think it's more of a question that can be linked to one which is slightly just after it, which is more linked to exactly how you measure and how do you define the rich and the poor when you draw the analysis. It's more of a clarification question on how do you create the categories and the quantiles based on which variable.
Okay. About the social mobility question, in particularly, we ask, each respondent is asked, out of 10 poor children, how many do you think will eventually live in a rich household? So that will be quantile 1 to quantile 5, that question. The average of that gives us that. And then we ask also, out of 10 rich children, how many will eventually live in a poor household? That will be from 5 to 1. That's the exact wording on the question. Is that clear?
I think so. And when you create the quantiles, is it a subjective measure of wealth for each of them, or do you construct an objective measure of wealth for the respondents themselves in order to categorize the respondents to a survey in quantiles?
Sorry. I think I'm not getting it. No, it's a subjective measure. Is what they think. The number that they think they will go from the bottom to the top, and that's all. Because we are not classifying them into quantiles. That's their subjective measure of quantiles. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so. And there's also an interesting question on the link between inequality and social mobility, highlighting that if the Mexicans have not managed to drive this connection from inequality to public policy, have they correctly linked high inequality to low social mobility?
Well, that's something that we potentially could explore. It's not we think that they fail to connect inequality to public policy, and we think that something, as we were talking in the other conference, something that we should do is that, we should give more information about the number of rich people that they are in the economy, what is the income that these people earn. But it is not something that we can see from our results if people really connect that low inequality relates to low social mobility, relates to high inequality. That's the other paper. That's the other paper, like the message of the other paper that we hopefully will be able, well, my co-authors will be able to present in this webinar, that of course high inequality is linked to low social mobility, but that's not something that we see here. in this paper.
Okay. And I think there was also a question on whether the percentage that say they're rich 0.6 is a
Oh yeah,
subjective
that's
measure,
not.
but no, right?
No, that's an objective measure. According to official statistics, less than 0.6% of people is rich. People, Mexicans, according to our survey, perceive that they are around 35% of them rich, based on an average minimum income to be considered rich of around 38,000 pesos per person. But 0.6% is an objective measure.
And also there are two questions which take us a bit beyond the scope of the paper per se. So I know if you would like to comment a little bit on the one on the tax and the one on inequality beyond income.
What taxes do you think is more accurate to reduce inequality? Wealth tax, heritage tax, that's that one. Well, according to some studies, like the thing is that wealth tax is people like can move around the world, right? And sometimes like if you tax in one country, people can move around to these fiscal paradises, right? So still we need to figure out what to do. In our case, we propose to be in our paper, one of our policy recommendations is just to be more transparent, because people do not know the amount of people that they are rich and the amount of income they earn. Like we don't know public policymakers to give names, but just to say this is the amount of income rich people are earning. Maybe if there's more transparency, we as Mexicans can decide whether we would like to tax more these kind of people. Like it's like a political economy argument more than in our case. Like as Mexicans, since we have a democracy, we should decide what to do, but we need transparency to do the best thing or what we think it is best for us. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think so. And about the one on inequality being something which is beyond income, I don't know if you would like to add something.
What is even
the last one?
It is the one. Don't you feel that inequality large? That one?
Yeah.
Don't you?
I think you've already responded a little bit by linking exactly income inequality to social mobility.
Don't you feel that inequality largely operates beyond income, something which construct income inequality and shape social mobility? I'm not sure if I understand this question. Don't you feel that inequality largely operates beyond income, something which construct income inequality and shape social mobility? Inequality is not only about inequality of income, but also inequality of opportunities. Exactly. Yes, that's something that we are taking care of here in the paper. That goes beyond that. Inequality of education, inequality on public services, for example. That's something more about, again, the second paper that we will hopefully we'll have time to present it in a webinar, right? But yes, here we are just looking at inequality on income and not necessarily on inequality on opportunity. But that's right, I agree with that. Yeah.
And maybe a broader question on what you touched a little bit upon, which is how people actually know how much taxes they pay, because we saw that people don't always know how many rich people are, but they don't always estimate the right amount or the right percentage of their incomes that they pay in taxes.
Yeah.
So I think it would be interesting to reflect maybe a little bit on that, and again, how can that be linked to public policies and broadly strategies in international cooperation as well.
One of the things that we thought is that maybe people perceive that they pay more than what they are actually paying, because they do not receive quality services. For example, we pay taxes, we as Mexicans pay taxes, but sometimes we don't see these reflected in good quality education and good public security. We see in our streets that there's an upsurge in violence. So maybe that's why people connect, people perceive that they are paying much more because they don't see reflected this into the quality of public services that they get. Also, health services. A lot of people that pay taxes don't use the public services. This is not like other countries, for example, in which, for example, in the U.S., you go and you have a very good police. You receive quality public security, quality public services, and so that has been one of our reflections about why do people perceive that they pay much more than they are actually paying. Maybe because of that, because they do not see a good quality of public services, and in some sense their perception shows this.
Yeah, and I think maybe linked to that.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. And maybe public policy should be in, well, maybe like like this transparency can help if we knew, for example, that our resources or our taxes go, for example, to pay the public school of 2 poor people, maybe that will help us to want more redistribution, because we will say, well, our taxes are really actually being used on something useful, right? So transparency also is about that, about how our resources are being used productively, or are they being wasted in corruption. We don't want that. Like, public policy should be more transparent also in those ways, right?
Exactly. And I think on that, one thing of transparency that can be added is that of the cost of inequality, because on the one hand side, people indeed, they don't always see what a more equally distributed society would bring them, so what their taxes would actually bring them, but they don't always see also what are the costs of inequality for the society. So the two parts should go together. And
and that's why the second paper is important, right?
Exactly.
Hopefully, again, we will have time to present it.
And there's also a last question from Anne-Sophie on how Mexicans compare with other big Latin American countries in terms of tax compliance.
Yeah, that's something that I cannot give you a very exact number, but what I do know is that we don't have we have a very huge informal economy in Mexico. So in terms of tax compliance, like when we gave our statistics to the Undersecretary of Finance, he was saying, "Oh no, I don't get enough taxes. I think he thinks that like 22% of taxes is not what Hacienda gets, and maybe, well, that's what we calculate, but the perception of him is that a lot of people is not paying taxes. I think we are like 59% of people are working in the informal sector. I'm not sure about other Latin American countries, but we have a huge amount of people working in the informal sector and not paying taxes. And you can see it on the streets with this small one. That people are not that people do not pay taxes. I don't have that number, but if my co-authors are here, and want to answer that, I would be glad.
Great. So I think that there are no other questions, and we're also reaching the end of this first webinar. Next week, we will have a webinar on South Africa this time, and more specifically on the earnings inequality and how they play a role in inequality. We would like to thank all of you for being here today. A huge thank you to Aurora for your
Thanks.
presentation, and we look forward to seeing all of you for the next sessions of our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.